for me, I get the greatest enjoyment. My drive comes from a couple different places, actually. I think connecting people is one place, and then another is in seeing a measurable difference. And there are, of course, monitoring and evaluation criteria that you can have for like actually measuring. But something as simple as like I mentioned feedability, seeing more girls in a classroom. To me, I don't have to count the number of heads. We know there are more girls attending school. There are more girls eating. That just makes me so happy that, as I've learned during a pandemic, um, whether I can be present, whether I'm making the same salary, I'll keep doing the work. And so I know that it just drives me at my core. Um, and in this case, it looks like girls, but really I'd say in all of public health. I love just growing partnerships in public health.
Welcome to episode 22 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact. Today's episode features Dr. Nicole F. Roberts, the executive director of Feed a Billion, an international nonprofit that feeds girls around the world to prevent exploitation. She is an expert in public health and is also the founder of Health and Human Rights Strategies and runs the Super Bowl Brain Health Summit, among many other incredible things. Nicole and I talked about making dents in food insecurity and human trafficking, having a bias for action, the best part of the Super Bowl, and much more. Here is Nicole F. Roberts on People Are the Answer. Nicole, welcome to People Are the Answer. Thank you for joining me.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
It's exciting to connect again. It's been too long.
It's been a while, yeah. But I also think that's sort of where the world is. I feel like there are people I'm so used to seeing on a regular, like conferences, like those milestones that you annually or whatever, like run into people. And all of a sudden there's this gap of not seeing people for years.
Yeah, it's been strange. You mentioned, seeing people at conferences and stuff like that. I definitely feel like there were people that I just knew I was going to see them a few times a year at these specific events. These couple of years have gone by, but it doesn't really feel like it's been that long since I've seen them.
It hasn't. Maybe we'll talk about it, maybe we won't, but I happened to host an event at the Super Bowl, and for me, it was these bookends, which is why I think it's so like present in my mind as well. Is like we did the Super Bowl 2 years ago, and we had heard like there's something happening, right? Because it was like I think that year was
Right.
like February 1st, so it was like super early, and then all of a sudden we got back from Miami, and it was like pandemic. And then I just actually did our first in-person event, and so I literally have a 2 year like book-ended gap that I could say, oh my gosh, it's been exactly 2 years since I saw
Wow.
people, and it was the same event. And yeah, it was kind of wild.
It's a good way to give it some perspective.
Yeah, and both of those years were in the sun and warm, so it was great. It was
Nice.
great.
Well, thanks so much again for being here. And I'd love if you could just start by telling us who you are and what your current role is.
Sure. I'm Nicole Roberts. I'm the executive director of Feed a Billion. We're a nonprofit that works on 3 continents, and we're actually in the process of doing some expansion, but we feed girls in need around the world. Our purpose is to really work with child marriage organizations, human trafficking organizations, schools, even sport organizations, to ensure that girls are getting the nutrients they need every day to grow physically, mentally, and emotionally, as well as to be able to stay home with their families and go to school, as opposed to all the other options that exist.
Well, I don't think it can be overstated how important that work is. So I thank you, and we'll certainly dig further into Feed a Billion as we go on here.
Sure.
In general, what would you say motivates you?
I think for me, I get the greatest enjoyment. My drive comes from a couple different places, actually. I think connecting people is one place, and then another is in seeing a measurable difference. And there are, of course, monitoring and evaluation criteria that you can have for like actually measuring. But something as simple as like I mentioned feasibility, seeing more girls in a classroom. To me, I don't have to count the number of heads. We know there are more girls attending school. There are more girls eating. That just makes me so happy that, as I've learned during the pandemic, um, whether I can be present, whether I'm making the same salary, I'll keep doing the work. And so I know that it just drives me at my core. Um, and in this case, it looks like girls, but really, I'd say in all of public health. I love just growing partnerships in public health.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to be motivated by public health and by the girls that you're helping. So thank you for sharing that. And I like to ask my guests, where they grew up. So, I'm curious where you grew up and what it was like there.
Sure. Um, I grew up, well, I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So I was born in Louisiana, and then we moved when I was young to Missouri. So I would say I grew up in Missouri, and very, very different from anything I've lived in since
Mm.
I moved away when I went to college. But I grew up with this huge family. In fact, my grandparents and even one of my aunts and uncles live on the same street. Like all my
Wow.
aunts and uncles, all my cousins. Yeah, we were all together all the time. And when we went to school, we were even together. I had class with my cousins. So I've always been used to. It's so strange. I didn't get a sibling until I was 11, almost 12, and yet I never felt like an only child. There was always cousins around, people I was spending the night with or who were at our house. Like it was definitely sort of that like saying like it takes a village.
Yeah.
I think in our family, like it really was just like a village of people. It was great.
What a great asset to have around you growing up, so much family. And like you said, kind of replacing the siblings in your earlier life. Um, it had to be nice to have that kind of support around all the time.
It was, and I had a non-traditional childhood. I grew up with my dad, and so I think he, as a single dad, needed that village. He needed the help. And so it was great to have grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, great aunts. I mean, even friends. Everybody just gets called aunt in like the South and
Mhm.
the Midwest, or uncle. So like I got lots of aunts and uncles that aren't actually physically like genetically
You're right.
related to me, but but yeah, it was great. It was really great. Very
Awesome.
different than the life I live now,
Yeah.
which they all still live in the exact same town. In fact, I'm the only one
Oh
that's moved.
wow.
Yeah.
So it must be like going back in time when you visit.
Yes, I did it just a couple weeks ago. And yeah, nothing's changed. And like you go to my grandparents, I'm so lucky both my grandparents are still alive. You go to their house and like everyone comes over. And like I said, even one set of family lives down the streets. Like they just walk down. Like it is kind of going back in time.
That's great. I'm glad you still get to go back and visit. Um, so where did you go to school, or like what was your first departure from Missouri like?
I went, well, I stayed in Missouri for undergrad. I went
Okay.
to Mizzou, and from there, I sort of hovered around. I went up to Chicago for graduate school immediately. Um, and then I completely departed and went to North Carolina to do my doctorate. And since that time, so for the past almost 20 years now, I've lived pretty much between North Carolina, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. I've just sort of, for whatever reason, now I've had stints a couple months at a time in different cities all over the world, but yeah, I don't drive a car. I'm a city person. so So you can't do that in places like rural Missouri. So I've
Right.
really sort of through school then sort of anchored myself, and right now Washington D.C. has been home for a very long time.
Nice. Well, North Carolina, DC, Chicago, all great places.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so you got a variety of degrees. It's really the stuff that you've worked on within those has been incredible in the research I've done. And what was sort of your first step after that?
I don't know that there was a step after. For me, it was like most people have somewhat of a linear path. Mine really was just like this big cyclical sort of thing that happened. Um, because I was in undergrad, I was psychology and biology undergrad, pre med, thought I was going to be a neuroscientist. And then I panicked. And when I went to grad school, I thought, I'm going to end up writing prescriptions for the rest of my life. It was that time where where it was, I felt like um, I was just going to get stuck somewhere in the middle of a medical school class and I was going to work in a hospital and just write prescriptions. And it just sort of stuck with me. And I wanted to change the system. And so I worked at the Center for Neuroscience, but I actually got my master's in public policy, thinking if I could, effectuate change at a government level throughout communities and states, that's how I could really impact healthcare. And then I went on to do my doctorate and I dug into things like mental health, juvenile justice, again, trying to think of how do we change the broader systems. And my doctorate's in public health, but that journey, as I say, it was, nowhere near linear. I actually, in the process, had a dissertation chair pass away. So I timed out. I went back, I started over, and I ended up writing my dissertation based on work I was doing in neuroscience on public private partnerships. And what that did is it really got me to focus on, well, earlier you asked, like, what drives me? Like, where do I find my joy? And I realized and I said, like, connecting people. And it wasn't until I was actually working on my dissertation that I realized partnerships. That's what I love doing, creating, whether they're small partnerships or they're global, these huge multinational partnerships. And so I wrote my dissertation on it. And actually, a work call I had right before this, someone said, "Hey, will you send me the link to your dissertation that I wrote years ago?" But we were talking about how do you build healthcare partnerships.
Right.
And so, truthfully, some of the work I've done is really just a continuation of work I did in school, but I always worked while I was in school. And so I think, for me, that made a big difference.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I've been all over the place since that time. I had everything from a fellowship at the State Department to I've run a human rights firm that I founded for about a decade. Even while running Feed a Billion, I've kept the human rights firm going just because there are boards I sit on and work that I do that um, it's a bit easier to do under that sort of nonprofit umbrella of a human rights
Right.
firm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that sounds interesting. Your work on public-private partnerships and healthcare. I'm curious in general how you feel about public-private partnerships. Are those the answers to a lot of our problems? I mean, I personally also want to add that I'm the type that loves making connections as well, so I can certainly
I know.
relate to that. So,
I know you do. Um, it's amazing when you connect the right, like 1 and 1 can equal 50. If you connect the right two ones, it doesn't have to. If it equals 2, I almost feel like I failed, right? Like
mm,
we could have just done that. Um, are public-private partnerships the answer to a lot of questions? Yes. To all the questions, no. In fact, I think there are not only real challenges to partnerships, but I think there's a lot of opportunity, especially when you start thinking about. I have a few, I won't name them, but a couple of examples that come to mind with like government entities, right, and academic centers, and there's opportunity for corruption in there. And when you create these big partnerships, it's really hard to make sure that everyone is doing everything they're supposed to be and that everything's above board. I mean, they are a true labor of love from
Mhm.
everyone involved. You all have to be so committed to the purpose and the mission. The trust has to be there. And it's very easy, particularly with government, um, for things to go awry. So
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
I suppose in an ideal world, yeah, partnerships are always the answer. You can't do anything alone. Certainly not in the big problems. At the same time, there are plenty of examples where lack of accountability or some corruption or,
Yeah,
you know, data issues can lead
right.
to trouble in partnerships.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine all the various things that can go wrong. Are there any that you've been a part of that you've been particularly happy with?
Oh, I thought you were going to say they've gone wrong. I was like, oh no,
No, no, I
but
don't want you to have to talk about them. We can all imagine things that can go wrong, but I'm
yeah,
curious if there's any that you've particularly been, think set the example.
yeah. Well, there's one actually. It's happening now, um, with Feedabillion, and it came from what I would not say is a failure, but it was a partnership that we realized this isn't doing what we're supposed to do, and it led to this incredible thing, which is essentially in India, in one of the communities we work in, we and our team is very global and we live in different places, and yet one miscalculation we all had was when we think of a meal, we think of a hot meal. And I particularly thought of like a plate and right, you sit down and you eat your meal. Unfortunately, we found out that in one of our communities, when we provided girls a hot meal, their families would actually take a meal away from them. And right, and I know that that's for a lot of us, it's a very difficult thing to process, like taking food away from a child. And yet, I try not to judge because I can't imagine the circumstances that those families and parents are living in which that's it enters into their mind and that's part of the equation, right? And then they decide that's the better choice than whatever else is happening. But yeah, essentially we found out that by providing a hot meal, girls were actually losing food, and that of course was not our goal. We want to be a complement, not a substitute. And so we ended up partnering with a football club, soccer for
Hmm.
Americans. But, you know, it became so obvious that the one place we could ensure two things: children, particularly girls in our case, but children would go, even when school was out, was the dirt patch. They would play, right? You
Mm.
throw out a ball, the kids will come running. They'll play. They'll play every day. Kids don't even have to speak the same language to play. Two, that a meal doesn't have to look like what we thought it did. And so I started working. We have a whole team that we put together of nutritionists and neuroscientists to create these optimal formulas for different age brackets so that a girl can literally, it'd be like what you and I would think of like a protein shake:
Mm.
powder, water, shake it up, drink it. And yet, we can ensure that, say, a bunch of 10-year-olds, 8 to 10-year-olds, are out playing with one of our formulations that's really geared towards that age group, that by drinking that drink, they're getting all the micronutrients they need for where they are with their body and brain development. And so even if they don't get anything else that day, we know that we can check off like they've got the things they need to be sustained, and we always say nourished, right? It's not just the bare minimum, like we want to nourish them. And that has not not only succeeded, it has become our primary model. And we have partners who are now making these products to be shipped literally all over the globe. And it's all done because of sports.
Wow.
Putting the equivalent of like a protein shake, as we think. I mean, it's a lot more than that, but
Right.
a shake in the hands of kids, and really it's coaches, teachers, and they
Yeah.
have all these packets, tear, right? I never would have imagined that you throw
Yeah.
out a soccer ball and you can feed all these children. Um,
Wow.
it completely changed how I thought of a nutritious meal, completely.
Yeah.
And those partnerships have just grown. You can imagine every district community is like, we have a soccer field, we have a what, like, oh, our
Right.
girls prefer to play cricket, we do the great, here you go.
Yeah.
It's been awesome.
That's really exciting to hear. Certainly a great example of partnership at work. Um, I noticed on your resume that you spent some time at the Mercatus Center. Certainly been interested in the past in some of the work that's taken place there, and I was interested in learning about your time there.
I don't think anyone's ever asked me about that. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. uh, Apparently no one else is interested in like economic fellowships.
I, some of the, not everything, but some of the libertarian values resonate with me. That they espouse. So,
Yeah. Um, so it was actually a fellowship that I had there. It was during my dissertation period of time, and not the whole thing. Just I was a fellow for a semester. It was so eye opening to me for a number of reasons. I thought having gotten my master's at U Chicago, I kind of thought I was like decent at economics, like just kind of by default of being around.
right.
um, to be in school, be writing my dissertation, be doing research, and then also have this little fellowship on the side where I'm surrounded by economists in Washington, D.C. That was a totally different ballgame. I mean, I, there are days I just felt like I sat there and went, aha, aha, aha. But it was so informative um, for a number of reasons. One, on the policy side of things, to hear perspectives and arguments, and I mean arguments in a good way, right? Like
Right.
real discourse on, okay, this is a good idea. How do we actually get this done? Is it worth doing? Right? If we have this alternative option over here, which we can do more for less, like those sorts of debates were fascinating because I don't think at a right leaning or a left leaning think tank or organization or university, you're going to get that same sort of rigor or that what I would consider to be really honest discussion. And here in DC, I mean, it's been years since I had that fellowship, but to live in DC and see things, I'm choosing my words very carefully here, um,
That's fair.
become so polarized,
Right.
so divisive. Um, to think back on a time when people had honest debates, and in that case, from a really economic perspective of can we or can't we, and if we can, how? And how do you optimize it? How do you make it cost effective? How do you apply real world? And that's where I stepped in, I think, and I had my strengths is my background in neuroscience. I come at everything from a decision science and behavioral science standpoint in public health. So I'm like, okay, that sounds great, but how do people actually behave?
Yeah.
And people aren't rational. Of course, you can imagine that
It's
in a
very
fellowship,
true.
right? In a fellowship around economics, there's a lot of discussion on rationality. Um, People aren't rational. We're humans. We're not built to be rational. We're built to survive and procreate and do very like core basic things at the end of the day. And yeah, it was a really, really fascinating time. It also, as I said, was during my dissertation. So I got to sort of live in an academic bubble at that window of my life. Yeah, it was, there's probably far more that I learned and didn't even realize I learned just by being around or in the same room as a lot of the conversations that were happening.
Well, it sounds like that was an impactful experience for the rest of your career.
Yes. Well, and certainly when you are in a place that is not far left or far right, um, it introduces you to a very different network in and around DC, a very different group of think tank people and academics that um, often I lump myself with them when I say this part of like the kind of try and stay away from the extremes. I don't often
Right.
find a lot of value at the
Yeah, or a lot of rationality.
at the extremes, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I don't think about that period off. I also feel like I've got my own sort of post traumatic stress, if you will, from my dissertation. So
Mm.
just kind of like leave all of that over there.
Well, we won't harp on it for too long then. So, we've talked kind of about your early career. I wanted to, and you mentioned some of the things that you've started over the years. A lot of them are still current and ongoing. So I wanted to bring up some of them.
Yeah,
Um,
too
you know,
many. Too
I,
many are
I
ongoing.
think, I think one of the first ways we met was via your work as a Forbes contributor on global health and policy. I know we have a bunch of people in common that we found out through that initial conversation, but I'm wondering, have you enjoyed writing with Forbes? What's that been like?
That's been a journey. It's a very good journey, but a journey just by pure happenstance of timing. And that maybe is how we met. In fact, I think we met before I realized I knew your family,
Right.
right? Like,
Yeah, I think we were talking about the cannabis industry.
yes, yeah, cannabinoids. I did a
Yep.
lot of writing about cannabinoids. And then I was like, hey, wait a minute, I know your sister. Um, because I was, anyway. So the Forbes journey, what has made it so interesting is the timing. So the whole world, I think, recognizes that in the last decade, and I've written for Forbes for about 10, 11 years, I think, media's gone through a real transition. And so when I started writing for Forbes, I was very lucky. I had no background in writing. And in fact, I think the first two articles I wrote were so heavily academic and footnoted that they were like, have you ever written a blog? I said, no, I haven't actually. I have no idea what you're talking about. But then I was probably only there for a couple years before the contributor models
Mhm.
stepped in, right? And so when I started, they reached out to me and said, you're working on your doctorate in this. The Affordable Care Act is, at that point, it was passing, it just passed. And they said, we're looking to, sort of diversify our voices on healthcare. And I think their healthcare team was really small at the time. And like every magazine and every online sort of forum, I shouldn't say every, but most, it was a lot of,
Mhm.
older white men, especially around policy.
Yeah.
And so they're like, we'd love to hear new perspectives about healthcare reform and what's possible. And I think, truthfully, the Obama administration had a lot to do with sort of like, we're looking to expand sort of who we hear from. And so I said, yeah, of course. And so the first, probably a couple years, it was very academic. I wrote very much about health policy and what was going on in DC, the Supreme Court cases that were happening once the ACA passed. And then finally, when they shifted to the contributor model, and it was like they opened sort of the floodgates and they said, we now want a bunch of people from a bunch of different healthcare backgrounds and everyone can sort of free for all, but you have we called them swim lanes. And I said, well, now would be a good time to mention to you that like global public health is what I actually do. I don't want to write about the Affordable Care Act, and I can, but I really am like not interested. Um, and so they said, oh, but the contributor model was great because they said you sort of choose your own adventure as long as it's a real area of expertise, right? Not just making it up and going, I'm now a branding expert. I was like, no, I'm working on my doctorate in it. Like, this is what I actually do. And so they gave me that flexibility that if I wanted to write about Ebola in the Congo, I could write about Ebola in the Congo. If I wanted to write about some cool new device, I could do that too. Um, it was just the flexibility was great. And then there came a point at which, and this happened across the board, there were way too many contributors, and so they had to really scale back. I think HuffPo, they even like, I think when they canceled their contributor model, they didn't even tell anyone. People just like couldn't log in one day. It was crazy. Yeah, and so Forbes then sort of whittled down and said, we want, a couple people in global health, a couple people in this, and it made a lot more sense. And so yeah, they've just sort of, like every magazine and online forum, they've ebbed and flowed and gone with the trends and what makes sense for, as you can imagine, the pandemic started and they needed a lot more people who were experts in epidemiology and global health, and so they sort of opened back up again. So it comes, it goes. There are periods of time when I write a lot. I have a lot to say. There's a lot in my wheelhouse. There are other times, like the past 6 months, I don't think I've written once, which is terrible. But I started my own podcast, and so there's only so much creative energy I have each day. And
I get that.
I can't both like write an episode and write an article. I mistakenly thought they would go hand in hand, and it'd be like two birds, one stone.
Right.
Not at all. This is a completely different medium.
Absolutely. I've started to get used to it and continually learning more about it. And while we're on your sort of creative bend, I'd love to hear about the Global Good podcast.
Yeah, it's getting rebranded. So depending on when you publish this, our rebrand should be done. Yeah, it was an experiment. It started out as a TV show idea, of all things. I went to Nat Geo and I said, essentially, like, hey, I've worked in 50 countries probably or more. I happen to have this network of just incredible human beings who are literally changing the world. And I think it'd be fun to put together a travel show and not where some celebrity goes on there, whatever, or not. Let's go observe these people like it's an experiment of some kind. But I was like, let's go to these places with the people doing the work. And so one of the examples I just mentioned, like Ebola in the Congo, I said, someone else I think we have in common, I said, let's go with Dikembe Mutombo. People think of him as a basketball player. Deke's built hospitals and schools all over the Congo, which is his home. Why not go with him? And in that case, there is a celebrity aspect, but like, let's go to those hospitals. Let's learn about what an education system is there. And I started a spreadsheet of people and countries and topics, everything from, criminal justice to climate to food security. In fact, our first episode was the guy who founded Feed a Billion. And I said, well, one, I know you really well, and I know your story, so it'd be a good first episode because I won't be quite as awkward. And I said, take us home. He's from India. And I said, take us to Muzaffarnagar in India and tell us why you started this nonprofit. And then from there, we hopped to Rwanda and talked about vision and this incredible organization that now has built vision clinics all over Rwanda. In fact, it's completely sustainable now to the point that when the pandemic started and all the foreign nurses and doctors left, they not only maintained all their clinics, they've added staff to all of their clinics. I mean, you're right. It's a model that everyone should be looking to. We've gone underwater with the guy who runs our Nemo program. We've got, it's just incredible. Like, there's no place on Earth that is off limits, literally underwater, space. We talk about doing good. That's the whole point, is to introduce you to people who are actually doing, and the people who are so busy doing the good shit, they literally don't promote themselves. They don't have time. They're not interested, right? They're just doing. And so I get them like this for an hour and we talk about why. And usually those stories, they start really hard. Like you can imagine, Rwanda, we start of a genocide. Like, where did this come from? It came from genocide. India, why did you start Feed a Billion? Because food insecurity is so high amongst girls that 60% of girls in some schools don't graduate. They're married off or sent to some form of work. We'll call it work, right? Denture of some kind. Exploitation is what it really is. And so it's like you got to start somewhere tough usually, but it's because the people who are doing that incredible work, that doesn't come from a place of like, oh, I've always had this and this is. It's people who've been through stuff and they've seen stuff, and they're solution oriented, and and every other week we do these little I call them diversions, and they're little segues sort of from like one country or topic to the next, where it's honestly usually something where I went, I had no idea, and then like we just dig in and do a really short episode and like, I didn't know this. Did you? This is where this comes from. Like, I had no clue that this existed. And it just sort of segues right into our next destination. But it's a podcast. I love that. Yeah, it's a video podcast, but also an audio podcast. Because I pitched the idea, I want to say 2 weeks before the pandemic started. When I said like, oh, let's do a travel show.
Yeah, rough timing.
They're like, mail over that pitch. Wait, don't forget it. Stay home. Don't do anything. It's been enjoyable, but as we just mentioned a minute ago, like, podcasts are hard. They're much harder than one would think, sitting down and just having a conversation with someone. I mean, the storytelling, in our case, grounding people in a place and a problem. I mean, you can imagine we got a bunch of requests to do one right now on sort of Ukraine and Russia. And I actually elected not to, because I said, I don't know that I would nail the scope or scale of that conversation. Right. Because there's so much, and I have a network that could tell you what's going on, but the history and the context, and there's so much there that I don't think I would ever walk away from a 30-minute to 50-minute episode and feel like we did justice to that sort of global good context piece of the equation.
Right. Yeah. That's a responsible perspective to have on that. And I can certainly appreciate that. And the behind the scenes work that can go into a podcast trying to do it well. And that said, I can definitely appreciate your desire to highlight people that aren't necessarily highlighting themselves. That's certainly part of what I've been trying to do here. And I'm excited to...
it dovetails with what you're doing. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, but like, I mean, people are the answer. That is literally... I'm almost mad it didn't occur to me as the title of the show.
Yeah, I was very happy when I landed on that. And, you talked about your interest in connecting people. And that was sort of the realization I had as I was developing the idea for this podcast, is that I've built a really good network of people that are doing incredible things. And many of these people are the answers to our problems that we're having all over the world, and in a variety of capacities. So it was just, it was cool to, have an opportunity to express my creativity and also to highlight this awesome work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you just way better and more succinctly said what I should have said. Yeah, that's why I started the show. And for me, I think the other aspect that I hope really sets it apart is it's all about action. It is about doing global good. I don't want people who come to our website or our podcast to be passive listeners. In fact, on our website, it's like the first page is episodes and the second page is just called Take Action. Every episode has a mirror on that page that essentially is just clickable resources of everything that we talked about during the show. Places you can volunteer, donate, get involved, how to do it yourself if it's something that can like literally be implemented in your community. The entire purpose is to do the good. Like, not just hear about people doing good, like actually go out and do global good. Because it all starts, I mean, it could even be in your own house, right? One of our episodes is unfortunately on domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And I did that one from a neuroscience perspective and brain injury, and the resources there. That one, um, that one really touched me in a way that I couldn't have anticipated, just because the number of people who, by sharing those resources, I think that one is the one that really first spoke to me, that I didn't realize how much just putting a list of resources out there for people could, like, how much it could mean to them, or how many clicks those resources would actually get. And
That's That's awesome. My dad, one of his kind of key things in life was always having a bias toward action. And I can really appreciate that about what you're doing. And, while I always ask my guests about ways to support their impact and have links in the notes, it makes me want to create an action page of some sort on each of these topics. So yeah, it's certainly something I'll start working on.
do it, because people will
Yeah.
click, right? I mean, that to me is like, we do it on it, whether we're on our phones or we're on our laptop. Like, we're so programmed to click at this point. If you can click on all those Instagram posts,
Yeah.
and I'm equally guilty, right? Like, if I'm learning something and I can go, huh, really? Like, I can click on it. And then the next thing you know, right, there's resources, there's education, there's information. Even if you don't know you're learning something, you might really be learning something.
Yeah, I love that. And this gives me an opportunity to briefly mention a organization I've had a chat with recently, and we were talking about clicking for good. It's a Chrome extension called Fundrage, and their website is gofundrage.com. And you install this Chrome extension,
I'm writing
and
this down.
then when you're on, okay, cool. That when you're on websites that the media bias chart that they use deems as being legitimate, then and you're reading an article, you'll be able to click the Fundrage button and it'll offer you nonprofits to donate to based on what you want to act on. And they all meet certain criteria if they're going to recommend them, but you can donate right there from the page in the article. Say it's a climate change article that you're reading and it's making you feel rage. You
That's
click on this
brilliant.
button and you can, yeah, it's awesome. I recently met the founder, Maria, and was really excited to hear about her drive. She's background in nonprofit work and has been bootstrapping this, and
Oh my gosh, send her
would
my
love to help
way.
her grow it. Okay,
I'm
absolutely.
selfishly inserting myself into your plug. Send her my way,
Oh,
because every episode, as I said, that I do is grounded in something that usually starts out pretty awful. And the whole point is, like, to get people worked up about whether it's plastics in the environment, or genocide, or, whatever it is, domestic violence. I would love to support that. Yeah, more, any more ways to get people to take action. That's awesome.
yeah, I will definitely send her your way, and hopefully we can turn that into a thing that a lot of people have. Eventually, they'll have an app and everything. So, yeah, I'm glad it came up.
Yeah, that's awesome.
In part of our discussion a few minutes ago, you mentioned working in something like 50 countries. Be curious just to hear more about some of the countries you've been to, some that you've spent extended periods of time in, and how that's been.
Wonderful, adventurous. I'm at a different point in my life than when I did a lot of that work. Um, there are many decisions I made in my 20s that I don't regret at all, but I would not do now. Like,
Yeah.
I I was not good at sticking with the group, or in the couple of cases where I had like a body person with me, like, I'd just leave the hotel and be like, you know what? I learn a lot more when I'm on my own. Um, People in charge don't like that kind of thing. But
Yeah. Glad you made it, though.
yeah, here we are. Um, my favorite place in the world is, usually people ask, like, what's your favorite place? Nepal, no question. My favorite place in the
Yeah.
world. I've never spent more time somewhere. I'm like my second home, but I've never been somewhere where people are so kind, even when they have nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
just the giving nature of the Nepalese people, the wild, and I mean wild in the most flattering way. I mean, they've never been owned. right? And so it's these free people who just, they've got all the tension of India and China and all the delicious flavors of both
Yeah.
smashed into this place in the Himalayas where, you know, they have just carved their own path literally. And it's the only place in the world I work where, whether I'm there a day or a month or 3 months, I gain weight because I just eat. Everything is so good. Um, I mean, there's obviously, I've done lots of work in India and Bangladesh and surrounding areas as well. I mean, I always enjoy islands. Very biased
Yeah.
towards islands. I think the work that's been the hardest has been probably in Haiti, which I didn't expect. And I highly encourage people to go, particularly if you have a mostly domestic US audience. I mean, it's a 2 hour flight from Miami. It is not hard to get to Haiti.
Mhm.
And the amount of good that can be done, whether you're talking about hospitals and clinics or schools, it's just a country that can't seem to get a fair shake. You
Yeah.
know, natural disasters, conflict, like it's so close, and yet it's just, they need all the help they can get, and yeah, so that holds a very special place in my heart. And I speak Japanese, so
Oh wow.
I just gotta. It's nice to feel like, you know, when you can converse freely, it makes life a lot easier. Um,
Right. Absolutely.
yeah, and then otherwise, I'd say Argentina, just because I I really like an earthy Malbec. So
Yeah.
I love I love working I love working in Argentina, Uruguay.
It's really cool to see, how you've been able to go across the globe and do all this incredible work, and then also get to have these cultural experiences and, bring back some of your learnings to other people here. I mean, for example, just even mentioning that Haiti's only 2 hours from Miami on a flight, I think gives people perspective that it's closer than they probably think.
Yeah, we have, and I say this as an American, we have this constant sort of like, it's an over there problem. We've seen a lot of that in the last couple of years, I think, in
Yeah.
particular, right? Um, I mean, the fact that, and I won't go on a vaccine rant, but I mean, measles still it still exists. Polio still exists. The reason we don't deal with these things is because we have vaccines. And yet you see here in the US, there are some zip codes that have, I'm not making this up, and I'm not talking about COVID. I mean vaccines across the board, childhood. We have some zip codes in the US that their vaccine engagement with children is on par with South Sudan.
Wow.
Those parents in South Sudan would give anything to protect their children and to vaccinate their children. And so, whether it's an infectious disease or poverty, or, you know, we always are something like, it's over there, it's someone else's problem. And first of all, that's not true. Human trafficking exists in every zip code in every community in the United States, right? It's not an over there problem. Poverty, food insecurity. I mean, right now, we're looking at around the world, 1 in 4 children don't know where all their meals will come from this week. That includes the United States. There are
Yeah.
shelters that look like schools, where they look like regular schools from the outside. They're actually violence and trafficking shelters for children. They start at age 12. That's here. That's in all of our cities across the US.
Yeah.
We just don't like to talk about it. We like to think it's someone else's issue. It's really not. These problems are not only at home, they're close to home, they're a couple hours away on a flight. There's absolutely no reason, especially as people get back out in the world. When you travel, I know travel is supposed to be fun and special, there is absolutely no reason you can't also do either good and
Yeah.
volunteer and or at least learn. And I
Yeah.
don't mean, there's a phrase I use that some people like it, some people hate it, but I call it pourism. And so I'm not speaking about
I see
pourism,
what you're saying.
where you travel,
Yeah.
where to a low income country and just like, whoa, people live like this, right? I don't mean that kind of insincere sort
Yeah.
of looking out, your window at poverty. But I mean, like, there are real ways when you're traveling to get involved, to volunteer, to, as you said, even just be in the community.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best thing I've ever done and can recommend is scrap anything that's on the itinerary of like where you should go and what you should do and spend a day just like hanging out. Like,
Yeah.
whether it's a coffee shop, a restaurant, you will meet the realest people and just ask them questions about where should I do this? Where should I? They will find you the best food you've ever had, even if it's street vendors. They'll point you
Yeah.
in the right direction. Um, those are all the experiences and things I've learned that no meeting or five-star hotel or any of
Right.
that can give you.
Well, you make great points in terms of the tremendous amount of work we have to do at home and abroad. And your mention of, while traveling to take part in some of this certainly resonates with me. My wife and I, we have one son who will be 2 in June, but long-term plans, I'm hoping that anytime we go on a family trip, we can incorporate some sort of community work or local social impact. Like you said, very much not from the lens of just going to look at it, like truly changing some lives and helping as we can because we're fortunate enough to be able to help. And doing things like that with my family certainly instilled those types of values in me. And I hope to be able to do that with my own family as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are, even if it's, and it's things that even have impacted you. By you, I mean, whoever's listening. Like, it's actually really easy, probably easier than it should be from a security standpoint, but it's really easy to volunteer places, especially in low and middle income countries. So, say like cancer, right, is something that's
Hmm.
infected your family, or you've lost a family. Like, you can go to like a women's cancer center and volunteer for a day in any number of cities and countries. Like, they're always looking
Yeah.
for people to help, right? And the same with, we have more displaced people in the world right now than ever before. Refugee, not camps per se, but centers and organizations, they can always use help. And it just gives you so much insight. The way the United States is positioned between water and, just where we are, we don't get in any way, if you've not left the US or you haven't done it a lot, how much movement there is with, and migration there is with people. We
Right.
move between states, right? You can go someplace in Europe and in half an hour you can be in multiple different countries. And so when there's conflict, right, the number of languages that you will pass in any given day, right? Um,
Yeah.
and different communities and peoples and cultures. Like, you can volunteer in any of these places and work with people who have been displaced for a number of reasons. People have had to leave their homes. And it just gives you not only a totally different perspective about how other people live, but again, it shows you, like I said, like, you can go anywhere else in the world pretty much, and people are so much closer, right? Different
Yeah.
countries and borders, and we just have all this space that
Yeah. That's true.
and it's all ours. Um, and yet we still find differences between us that
At an unbelievable level.
at
Yeah.
an unbelievable level. And yet, the US only makes up 4% of the world. We only
Yeah.
make up 4% of the world's population. And so it's really amazing when you leave here and step sort of out of that lens and you think about the power we have in decision making, in finance, in
Yeah.
world affairs, and that's 96% of the world that is not us, and yet we
Yeah.
like to tell everyone else how to do things. Um,
Yeah.
when you can sort of, to the best, I'm a human like everyone else. It's, we all are not as good at getting out of our own way as we think we are. But when you can get out of your own way and just sort of absorb, it's amazing what you can learn. And even just pause and go, why do we do this way? Not that it's right or
Yeah.
wrong or good or bad, but there's so many different ways to do everything.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of my things in business specifically and in nonprofit work is just I don't want to do things because they've always been done a certain way. And if someone's answer is, well, it's always been done that way, that makes me want to look more into how it should be done.
But well, then it's definitely the wrong answer.
Right. Well, speaking of all this international work, I think that's a good lead in to talk more about Feed a Billion. You told us about it a little bit, saving every girl from food insecurity and exploitation and trafficking by providing nutritious meals. Let's dig in a little further.
Sure. I love to talk about Feed a Billion. I've been there for 2 years as the executive director, and it's been a very rewarding 2 years. It's also been a very difficult 2 years. I mean, it coincides with the pandemic, and food insecurity has been on the rise all over the world. In some of the poorest countries in the world, we've seen food pricing. I think in some places it's up by 30-40%. I mean, so when you've got people living on a couple dollars a day and all of a sudden food's, you know, 30 times more expensive, it's really, really difficult to manage. And even here in the US, when you think about, I don't yet have children in school, I had no idea what our school systems were feeding children. And I don't even mean that from some like sitting on a pedestal, everyone should have organic. I mean, like, we feed our children absolute garbage, like no nutritional value at all. I recently learned in our public school system, we consider pizza vegetables because the tomato
What?
sauce, yeah, the tomato sauce on pizza is considered a vegetable.
That is, I mean, and I imagine the sauce they're using has quite a bit of sugar in it as well.
It's
It's
awful. It's awful.
pretty unbelievable.
Yeah. So, when we say, food insecurity, again, back to the conversation we are having earlier about like it's an over there problem. There are so many food insecure children in the US, girls in particular, around the world. What exploitation can look like is very different, um, very troubling. We often see in movies here in the US a very defined and narrow look at what human trafficking is. And it often involves, a young, pretty
Yeah.
girl and an older, rich guy and yachts and whatever. Girls can be exploited in so many ways. And it can even look like work. They can be pulled from school to work, indentured servitude. They can be married. In one area in India, I mentioned earlier, 60% of girls in one location didn't graduate because they were either married off or sent to work before they had an opportunity to even finish high school. And you know what that does is it just creates a cycle of poverty. I mean, if they don't finish high school, they're married, or whatever it is that they're doing or forced to do, right? They never get an opportunity to break that cycle. In places like Malawi, we see one of their highest maternal mortality rates is in 15 to 18-year-olds. That means a girl, or many, many girls, are married, giving birth, and dying at 15, 16. So, what exploitation looks like is very different all over the world. And yet, we know the greatest return on investment, literally anywhere in the world, is a girl. I want to say, I don't have my numbers in front of me, but like every 1 year of education increases a girl's potential by like 18, earning potential by like 18%. We also know that women and girls invest all their money back into their families and communities. And so what happens with just getting one girl through school, I mean, the rewards it reaps for her family and her community are just unparalleled. And so for us, when Dr. Ambush Jain first founded Feed a Billion, he really focused on feeding people and feeding children in general. And part of me coming in as executive director was like, what can we do really, really well? And it was building these global partnerships, and it was creating these products, and it was really focusing on the girl child. And, you know, I consider us a complement to everyone else. I don't consider any other nonprofit, I don't consider any food organization to be a competitor in any way. Our goal is just to make sure girls are getting the nutrients they need. And getting back to sort of my neuroscience, behavioral science background, you know, I think it's a secret, although when I talk about it, it's clearly not a secret. Secretly, what I see us doing is we're incentivizing parents to change their behavior. We're giving parents an opportunity to say, hey, there's food and nutrients in the school. It's on the soccer field. It's, wherever it is. Send your girls there. We'll take care of feeding them. You don't have to worry about that. So it takes a burden and a challenge off of families. And so what we're really trying to do, and we've had great success. In fact, in one of those schools that had a 60% or 40% graduation rate, 60% non, we had a 100% graduation. First one. 100% of the girls graduated. So we know we're having an impact. But yeah, what we're really trying to do is to not only nourish the girl, but get the family to look at the dynamics and say, it actually makes more sense for us to keep her home and send her to school than to do any of these other things. And that includes the United States, where we see all kinds of scenarios that one would think don't happen here, but they do. They certainly do. And again, it's often girls, almost always girls, that end up getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah, and on that note, when you came in, you mentioned that the founder was focusing on feeding a variety of families and types of people. Uh, what led you guys to focus on girls and realize that you could be even more impactful with that focus?
Um, a number of things. I mean, experience was one.
Yeah.
I tend to think anyone, particularly in the nonprofit space, anyone who starts out with an idea and is like, we know what we're doing, is just full of it. I mean, you have a good idea,
Yeah.
right? Like what the problem is and what you want to fix, but families are complex. People are complex. People, going back to our conversation earlier, they don't make rational decisions. And no two families are given the exact same choices. And so, you can build an ideal scenario and nonprofit and solution. It's not going to work for everyone. It's not going to work across, every community. You've got to be flexible, and you've got to learn how to not look at mistakes or setbacks as problems, but real opportunities to completely change or pivot. And I think that was something that we did well really early on. Was yes, in my heart, I want to feed everyone. In my heart, I want every child to go to school. I want to save the world. Right? It's not possible, but what we can do is have the most impact, on the ground. And that for us was girls. Like I said, it's the
Yeah.
greatest return on investment. And we're at a place where gender equality is thrown around as a term
Yeah.
a lot. Um, but we're not there. We're not even close. And in places like the US, we're much closer, but we still have disparities here. So, you amplify those in other places. And yeah, it was really easy for us to focus. And in fact, the very first thing I did when I became the executive director was our logo is the world, and it had a fork around it. And I actually took the continents out of the globe and I put a girl in it. And I was like, girls are the center of our world, literally, their entire, world. Um, and yeah, it was really easy for us to just keep sort of narrowing down, because there's any number of examples and statistics, and no offense to you, but right, like, even, you teach a girl to read, or a woman to read, and she'll teach her entire family. She'll teach the neighbors, she'll
Right.
teach the village. You teach a man to read, and he goes out with his cattle or his whatever, or he goes to work, right? Like, you don't get that same return that you
Right.
do when you educate a girl.
Yeah. That that makes total sense. And one thing that's tangentially been touched on in this conversation is the effect of, or the role that public health has in global security. Um, I'd love to get more of your perspective on that.
That makes me really happy. Thank you. uh,
Of course.
yeah, it's something we don't talk about enough anywhere. I mean, this last 2-year window should show us just how quickly and how, I mean, we got lucky. That's a really weird thing
Yeah.
to say, I know. Imagine if the death rates looked like some other diseases. I mean, we learned within 2 or 3 months something that was in place of COVID could have wiped out, you know, huge parts of the
Yeah.
world. I mean, global security is so dependent on public health. And if you look back at history, we we make the same mistakes and the same errors over and over and over and over again. And I don't just mean pandemics. I mean, you can look at the history of epidemics. You can go back to literally the 1400s, and the dynamics and scenarios play out almost identically to how we've responded to COVID. There's always, like, fear and anger and shortages. There's always lockdowns, and then people riot and revolt. And then there's mis and disinformation, and away we go, and the parties all split. There's an erosion of trust. And in fact, I wrote a couple Forbes articles about the psychology of pandemics and what would
Yeah.
happen. In fact, one of those articles became, I think, one of my most read articles of all time. I wrote it in, I want to say, March of 2020, April. And I said, there's going to be mass rioting,
Yeah.
like, around the world. That's just what happens. And then all of a sudden, it was racial injustice, but there was rioting all over. And I was like, yeah, it always takes, all the kindling was there, mistrust, fear, right? All those things existed. What people collectively needed was something that collectively angered them. And in this case, right, we had a video of a real injustice, and away we go. I think it would have happened no matter what. I think that was just the perfect sort of match to the kindling that had been built. Um, and so, whether you're looking about or at bioterrorism, which is like the most extreme,
Yeah.
or, something that's even the flu,
Right.
water. I mean, think about water. We, get back to that global local thing we were talking about. We talk about people not having access to clean water. Again, people thinking like, oh, over there and wherever there is, right, some village, they don't have clean water. We have Flint, Michigan. We have the public school system in South Carolina where we're letting kids drink water that we know isn't safe. And the same people who, to your point, implemented the system and are elected when all these things were discovered are still there.
Yeah.
Like we did nothing to really change. And so I think, whether it's local water supplies or food to how we get places to, something like bioterrorism. You
Right.
could drop a vial of something at O'Hare Airport. You don't even have to go through security, right? You could just walk through. I shouldn't be giving anyone ideas, but like you could walk,
Oh, jeez.
but you could walk through O'Hare, not even go through baggage, right? Just like do something, walk right back out, and within an hour, it's literally going to be all over the world. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
it's sorry.
it's scary, and I mean,
It is. It's very scary. And so I think this is another reason that as people get fearful, they inevitably turn inward. They want to, put up walls, or they want to say, we're only going to be dependent on ourselves, nationalism, no we have to work as a global community. Things like
yeah,
diseases, viruses, water, they do not belong to
right.
any one group or people.
Absolutely. And I think we have seen a lot of that unrest that you predicted, and not only in some of these bigger areas that you mentioned, but also just in the fact that crimes have gone up, that just bad behavior has gone up amongst adults and kids. You look at all the fighting on planes and stuff like that. And I mean, to me, that shows a role of public health and global security on the micro level as well.
Yeah. And yet,
Yeah.
unfortunately, with everything going on, when you look to, and again, this is totally predictable, but really disheartening, and I say that as a doctor of public health, at the very start of like the pandemic, for example, or any problem, there's a spike in trust in the quote unquote experts, right? In this case, the epidemiologists, the public health people, the infectious disease specialists. And then there's just this like plummet that happens, and it happens mostly, I believe, because of cognitive dissonance. People want someone to save the day, they want them to tell, but science is hard. And especially when you're
Yeah.
presented with something new and different, the number of iterations of recommendations of what we should do, of what we actually think this is, what it's supposed to evolve. That's literally the job of science, because if we just keep giving the same answer, it means we're not actually learning anything, right? Every input we get should change the outcome of what the recommendations are, what the solutions are. And yet, what happens in people's minds is once they hear something and they attach to it, whatever it is, to hear other things is so hard. Like this thing that happens in our head, we shut down. We cannot process lots of different kinds of information and feel safe and secure. And so we literally just attach to something, and anything that doesn't validate that is
Yeah.
wrong.
I mean,
It's
we've seen that erupt in our culture. So,
we have. It's like all these things were the perfect storm, and then we started applying words like fake news and hoax, and right, and it gives it a very easy, like you can just flippantly go, oh, I don't like that, fake news, and that's it. And you've shut down the conversation. um, and so we are in a really tough place where trust in, and I'm not saying it's all unearned, but trust in institutions and in, public health, global health, it's so low right now. It is so, so low that it's really disheartening, because the people who are fighting the good fight to keep us all safe, they're literally doing God's work while being mocked, threatened, abused. I mean,
it,
especially in other countries, we've seen real violence. Like community health workers have been attacked. Um,
it breaks my heart because these are the people that have dedicated their lives to people's health, and the way they're getting treated, the way that people are, coming up with random things that they won't, random motives that they have. I mean, many of these people have been working their whole lives to help people.
yeah, And that won't just go away. If there were some magic way that the world tomorrow just completely resets, and I think we're in sort of a
Yeah.
reset, at the moment, but say we just snapped our fingers and all of a sudden it was all like a thing of the past. The attitudes, the burnout, and I don't mean that like lightly, like I'm tired of doing this thing, I'm burnt out. In fact, there's a different phrase for it called moral injury that are, and I don't mean domestically, I mean I do, but I also mean like
Right.
globally, that our healthcare workforce is facing is real.
Yeah.
Nurses here in the US, we are somehow we went from like happy topics to like really negative things. Like,
It's all part of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
but like I mean, and I mean this kind of jokingly, but also really sincere. Like, for the next while, decade plus, we're kind of screwed. I mean, we have put nurses in, so many nurses in a position where, to your point, they feel like they have dedicated their lives to helping people who now
Yeah.
just don't listen, don't care, are
Right.
constantly putting them sometimes even in harm's way.
Yeah.
And we've seen in the last, I want to say, couple years, an increase in enrollment, which is encouraging, in schools of public health. Like I think
Cool.
last year I heard my alma mater, UNC, I want to say I heard we tripled our number of applications for people to go into public health, but nursing applications I've heard have plummeted. And
I believe it.
and we need
My wife's a nurse
nurses.
practitioner,
Oh
and
yeah, so you really know.
started off as an RN, and has put in tons of work throughout that time, and it's given me a little bit of a front row seat, at least at a micro level, to the healthcare system and sort of that moral injury that you're talking about. Um, and it's concerning for sure. I mean, even just the staffing issues that they're having. There's so many aspects of it that make their job even more difficult, and it'd be great if they received more support.
Yeah. And to your exact point, I was only talking about one aspect of it. I mean, there's already shortages all over. Um, the enrollment for new nurses is down. Plus, we are actually facing a retirement sort of wave. And I don't know the numbers, but I've had a couple of presentations that I've had to sit through about where our system is, that basically shows in the next like 5 years a significant number of our current nurses are eligible for retirement, and based on the last couple of years, they're all like, yeah, I'm retiring when I can.
Yeah.
And so that's why I said, like, even if things just magically got better tomorrow, the lingering effects of what our collective behavior has done,
Yeah.
our health system is going to feel it for quite some time. And I think
Yeah.
nurses is going to be the primary area where we really regret how things were done.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully there's some innovative solutions that come up and that continue to evolve, but it'll certainly be an issue.
Mm, yeah. Well, people
To,
have also come to expect a lot more care in their home. So, to your point about
mm,
innovation, like that'll be a really interesting move. We were told for years, decade, here in DC, we constantly heard telehealth wasn't possible, right? Like you can't get care, you can't pay for a visit. It was just a reimbursement issue, is all it was, right? And the pandemic showed that. The moment you couldn't be in
yeah.
person, guess what? We can do this. Is it
Yeah.
is it the person to person, skin to skin contact that doctors often need with a patient? No, right? There is no substitute for that. Is there so much that can be done this way or through a picture of here's what it looks like? Yeah. And it just took a
Yeah.
disruption to the system to go,
Exactly.
this is so easy to do. And in fact,
Yeah.
way more preferable than sharing germs with all these people.
Right.
I mean, it's all,
That was definitely one of the positive takeaways from the pandemic is just
yeah.
how it pushed us forward in technology, both in medicine and remote work and
Yeah.
things of that nature.
And so that, is a really, I think, bright spot in the future when we don't have enough nurses and doctor, people that are able to, like, I think these new mediums, it's going to be a lot harder for some of the gatekeepers to say no after these
Yeah.
floodgates have been opened. So, yes, you're right. There's a lot to be excited about in healthcare and in public health.
So we've talked a lot about the role of public health and global health, and I know one thing that you've done a lot of work on is brain health. I'd love to learn a little bit more about your Super Bowl Brain Health Summit that you mentioned earlier on in our conversation.
That is such an anomaly to the rest of my work, and yet it is very interestingly the one way that a lot of people know me. Uh, but it's a much more public facing event. So yeah, I host the Brain Health Summit at the Super Bowl, and it's only because and thanks to Lee Steinberg, who's an agent. He's often, for people who don't know a lot about sport, he's referred to as like the real Jerry Maguire. So the movie Jerry, he's a super agent, um,
Hmm.
and has been for decades now. And back in the 80s, he actually wrote sort of a manifesto, if you will, on concussions, and essentially said, I have guys who have won the Super Bowl and they don't remember even being in the host city, let alone the game, the practices. Like, they don't remember being there, like in the city. And they're there for like a week. And so he said, there's something happening here. And, as agents, these are our friends, these are our clients. Like, it's our responsibility um, to figure out what's going on and to be advocates for change. And it didn't go over very well. As you can imagine, it was the 80s, especially, like back then in particular, it was all about like
Right.
just the louder the crash, the harder the hit. Um, and so, yeah, he and I met about 10, well, it's been a decade, because we just had our 9th annual Brain Health Summit. And so every host city of the Super Bowl, during his annual Super Bowl party, he gives me the opening hour to do whatever I want. And I host a brain health summit, and we talk about, of course, injury and recovery and stuff like that, but we really anchor it to the host city. So this year in LA, we spoke a lot about, like, I had a producer, Kishori Rajan, on the panel, and we talked a lot about storytelling and the role that mental health and wellness, have in when you write a script. What do characters look like? What do they talk about? And it allows us to have conversations that we otherwise wouldn't have. And so we use that summit to talk about all kinds of things that, we get to use sport as a platform that we otherwise are having conversations during parties, that we couldn't get people to
Yeah.
listen to. But we sell out. We literally sold out 2 weeks in advance this year.
That's awesome. Um, I'm glad to hear that there's a lot of interest in that. Obviously, it's incredibly applicable for the NFL. And you brought up how you had the producer there, talked about storytelling. I've noticed that in my episodes lately, the storytelling aspect of people in need has really come up a lot, whether that's mental health needs or, you know, people that are incarcerated, getting a true understanding of their story. One of my an upcoming episode that will air before yours is with Alice Marie Johnson, who received clemency from President Trump a little while back. And her organization, Taking Action for Good, is working on telling the stories of people that need our help. And I've talked to a lot of people in Hollywood about it too. There's ways to integrate important messages into the content that is capturing people's attention without them feeling like they're getting hit over the head with education.
Yeah, and truthfully, this year, one of the things we talked about, I said, and I'll say it again, I was like, I didn't even think the movie Concussion was very good. No offense to Will Smith. But I can tell you, hosting this event for a decade now, the immediate response I got that next year at the Super Bowl was night and day. I did Radio Row and Media Row, and every interview I did, first of all, I like tripled the number of interviews. But second, people would go, so this is a real thing, huh? And so many people ended their question with, huh. Like, yeah, we've had this data since the 70s and 80s. Like, we know brain
It's a
injuries are a
shame.
problem, right? No one wanted to talk about it. No one wanted to address it. All of a sudden, you package it in this Hollywood thing, and people are like, oh,
Yeah.
really? Let's talk about that. That's interesting. It it completely changed the conversation and the dynamic, and you even see guys, not often, but you've already seen a drastic change when you have guys get hit and say, I gotta like take a timeout here, or they enter concussion
Yeah.
protocol. We never would have seen that in the past. We have coaches, Mike Singletary's one, who came out and said he's known for the big hits, and he said, I would never show the film today that I used to show back then.
Mm.
It's not how people should tackle. It's not how they should, execute. It's not how
Right.
they should practice. Evolution is, part of life. We used to joust. We used to be gladiators.
Yeah.
Football's going to stick around. We love it. Americans love violence. We all love violence. We're humans. But it can evolve. We can protect people. We can do better.
For sure. And very clearly showing the humanity of various situations is really the way that gets people on
Yeah.
board. We've seen it in a lot of areas, and um, I can appreciate that. And thank you so much for the work you're doing there. I think the Super Bowl is such an incredible platform for those messages.
Thank you. It's
Yeah.
fun. It's different.
Yeah. So I'm curious, do you have a story of when you had an epiphany or when you really saw how your work could affect change directly?
Mm,
Maybe you met someone that was like, wow, this thing that you had a hand in was changed my life.
yes, I am lucky enough that there have been a few of those over the years.
That's great.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what keeps me going. I mean, trust me, running nonprofits is not how one makes $1 billion. So
Right.
we have to do it by,
But hopefully feeds a billion.
yeah. Um, I think one of the biggest turning points for me was probably doing some work um, in India, actually, at the very, very start of my career. And I did not understand, particularly around, in this case, it was HIV in particular, but it could have been anything. I did not understand, in my mind, I guess, sorry, I was sort of talking around it, but when people talk about the caste system, I thought it was very much something of the past. And and so the first time I was really working in clinics in India, I did not understand at all the inability of women to be able to talk. And I just mean to talk.
Mm.
Certainly to talk about things like sex. And all of a sudden we've got HIV rates that are skyrocketing, and it's because the husbands were bringing it home, but the women couldn't talk about it, and so they were also then giving birth to children, which is totally preventable, right, with
Right.
HIV. What we did is we introduced nurses, female nurses, and the dynamic changed, and all these women kept saying thank you. It had never occurred to me that because they saw a male doctor and they were brought to the appointment by their husband or father, they never talked about real life, certainly not sex. And I don't just mean the act of sex, I mean like
Right.
STDs, childbirth, right? Like all these things. By simply putting a woman in the room or letting them have a one on one conversation in a hospital type setting with a woman, it was like the floodgates opened. And to have all these women who were at that point much, much older than me saying thank you. Thank you for bringing a woman into the space was just the most shocking
Wow.
thing. Because I felt like, first of all, I don't deserve anything for that. Like, literally, there's a person here. Um, but that to me, just you saw the power of what you said earlier, of just doing something different than the way it was done. Completely changed the outcomes.
Yeah, acknowledging the realities of their culture as well. Um, whether it seems weird coming from an American perspective or not. I think that's so important, and really incredible to hear how a small change like that could really change the lives of many women.
Yeah, we see it everywhere. I mean, yeah, you just put people near each other to have a conversation, and you never know what's going to happen.
Was there any experience during your childhood that really stuck with you and showed you the importance of giving back?
I don't know that there's one experience. I actually think I mentioned when you asked about my upbringing that I said I grew up with just a dad. Um, I think growing up in a very, very non traditional family, um, I think just sort of embedded that into who I am. I didn't have not only the nuclear family that everyone else has, um, people constantly, particularly with like a girl, are like, well, she should be with her mom. She should be with a mom. She should be with a mom. And so to grow up with a dad, and only a male, uh, I think I always just sort of knew my space, whether I wanted it or not, was sort of just doing things differently. And yet the outcomes could be just as good, if not better.
Yeah.
And so it just sort of, for me, was always a part of things don't have to look like what you think they do.
Yeah.
And that was just innate from, I mean, I've lived with my dad since I was 2. So, I mean, it was just
Right.
really innately, like, always a part of life.
So you've mentioned impact of a lot of great people in your life. Has there been anyone in particular or people in particular that you've considered a mentor?
I've had a lot of mentors. I'm very, very
That's great. I hear that answer a lot in this
good.
space.
Good. Yeah, I've had and they all serve a different purpose. One of my cousins once said to me, I thought of mentors when she said it as opposed to like dating partners. And she said something about how, when we think of like, there's, like your person, the one, whatever, meant to
Right.
be sort of thing. And she was like, really, you come across those people all the time. They're the people that get you to the next sort of place. Like, you're meant to be in that space with that person. It's not like there's only one. And in fact, the person you end up marrying or partnering with is someone who's a complement, right? That you figure life out. They're not like the one person that meets all of your needs, because no one can do that. And so it's really about the people who are there to help you with where you are, to learn from, to do whatever. And I really was like, oh, that's how I feel about all my mentors. Is they've looked different over the years, and I think maybe just acknowledging, like, growing up with my dad, I think the first couple mentors I had, I didn't even choose them per se, and they certainly didn't choose me. I think I just sort of attached to them and followed them around, but were women who were doctors or PhDs doing research, and I would apply to work in their labs because I wanted to, whatever it was they were doing, I knew I wanted some of that. And so,
Yeah.
they became mentors. And then there were very formalized sort of mentorships that I was intentional about as I grew. I would even say the founder of Feed a Billion was a mentor before
Yeah.
we were colleagues. He's older than I am. He's lived in many countries. He founded this thing. I love the way he thinks about the world. Um, I love his heart and the way he thinks about doing good and doing well at the same time.
Yeah.
And and so I don't even know if he would consider himself to be a mentor of mine, but I very much considered him a mentor.
Yeah.
And then he eventually reached out and said, I'd love for you to run this thing. And that was very validating, knowing, oh, I've looked up to you for so long about the way you do things. I had no idea, in turn, you either saw enough of that reflected in me, and or I've actually learned a lot of those things I wanted to learn. See, I've had a lot of mentors, and they've all looked very different, but they've all met sort of that place in life where I was, that I think there was some sort of gap that existed.
Yeah, I mean, seeing the way people do things that set examples for you, I mean, that can go a really long way in shaping how you work. And I'm sure it sounds like you've met a lot of great people along the way.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate. But you also put yourself in those positions in a lot of
Of
cases,
course.
right? You take risks, you don't mind asking. I mean,
Yeah.
that's you never
Yeah.
you never know until you ask. The worst that happens is
Right.
someone
It
says
does.
no. Right?
Right. Exactly. It doesn't hurt to ask. It's important to put yourself out there, and obviously that's gotten you very far.
Yeah, and like I said, a couple cases, I think I really just kind of approached people and was like, "Well, you're stuck with me now, so we'll figure out what
I
that
like
looks
it.
like."
Yeah. Do you have a question that you want to ask me?
I have a lot of questions for you.
We'll start with one.
Yeah. So first of all, what all are you doing? Because you seem to have your hand in so many things. And earlier you brought up like when we met, it was around cannabis and
Yeah.
cannabinoids and the science of cannabis, and yet you've had this evolution. So what sort of was your sort of transition there?
I'll give the short version. I'm the type of person that likes to do a lot of things, have a lot of irons in the fire, keeps me interested, and you know, try to find great people to work with in all the endeavors that I'm taking on. And so these days I run a residential real estate business, a film production business. I've had a design firm and a restaurant in the past, and the last 7 years focused a lot on cannabis and mostly on the ancillary side of the industry, things like software services and devices. And getting into cannabis really drove my understanding of the mess that was the war on drugs and what a ridiculous situation our criminal justice system is in. And learning that there are people making money in this space while there's still people in jail for this plant was really invigorating for me. Um, yeah, just really made me want to work on it. Joined the board at Marijuana Policy Project in 2017, and just have learned an unbelievable amount in that process. And I've been working to change cannabis laws, and then in the last few years, I've gotten more involved more broadly in criminal justice reform, doing a lot of work with Stand Together and some organizations that they work with, um, and just really getting understanding of the type of people that I like to work with and how I can help people doing great things sort of push to the next level in one way or another. And, that's resulted in this podcast. It's resulted in me, understanding my affinity for film production and the ability to create impact there. And just trying to kind of what my family taught me growing up, incorporating Tikkun Olam, repair the world into everything that we do. I've just been figuring out how to do that over the years, and it's taken me in a lot of directions.
That's awesome. And as you were listing all those things, it was remarkable to hear how something like this podcast actually checks off so many of those, right? Like,
For
in a
sure.
way, no, it's really interesting because in a way, it seems like a few disparate things, right? And yet, when you talk about your bigger why, they all perfectly fit together under that umbrella and make a ton of sense. Um,
Yeah. And that's taken a little while to come together and to make
it
sense,
has,
but
but it does make sense,
yeah.
and you're consistent in your purpose, which shines
Yeah.
through in each of those things. So even if it seems like it's this random thing over here, in fact, it's very much a part of that bigger purpose. That's awesome.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Um, and the next thing is, it might have come up already in a way, but I've been asking every guest toward the end of the recording if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
You know, the first couple of episodes of the Global Good podcast, I asked a similar question.
Okay,
And I stopped doing it because I decided it was too hard. Um, if I could
that's fair.
fix one thing,
I mean, someone asked me the question, when I offer a question, and I was like, oh man, that is really hard.
it's a
I'm sorry that I've been asking this,
no, do
but,
not apologize.
you
I'm
know,
just saying, I
th-
recognize this is such a hard question.
Right. There's so many ways to look at it.
There's so many ways to look at it. From the role I sit in right now, of course, we've talked about, um, you know, public health and food security are top of mind for me every day. And yet I would actually roll it back one step further, and it seems broad and vague, but I would say poverty reduction, um, because when people are not stressed about things like, can I feed my child, they make very different decisions. And so wearing that sort of behavioral science hat, but also the public health hat, if people could stop worrying about the basic human rights and human needs of
Yeah.
shelter, food, clean water, I would even add education in there, um, we can live up to our potential so much easier, and people make completely different decisions. And so, yeah, I think it would be, I think the best way to sort of repair the world, if you will, would be to figure out poverty reduction, like reduce poverty.
I certainly agree with that. It's, I've gotten similar versions of that answer because it's just so true. And, you know, we currently have the resources on earth
Yeah,
to provide people with sustenance and to where people won't have to worry about survival every day and they can focus on things they enjoy or things that they're good at, bringing other interesting things to the world. And the most difficult process amongst our culture is determining the best way to do that. Obviously, there's so many political questions around giving people sustenance, but I wish that there was. And I know that, some of my libertarian friends, for instance, might not like me saying like everybody should be given resources.
yeah,
But the fact is, like, we should live in a world where everyone has their basic needs met in some
yeah.
way or another.
And I think so, I would say it a little bit differently, as opposed to being like everyone should be given that. Like everyone deserves a shot in hell.
Yes,
Like
that's better.
everyone deserves a basic shot in hell at life,
Yeah,
and we don't give that to so many children, so many
yeah,
children. Um, and then we
it's true.
expect them to physically, mentally, and emotionally do things the way we want them, or we think they should, and yet we've given them absolutely no resources to do that. That's
Yeah.
not fair. That's not a fair request.
I mean, given where the Earth is today, it's really devastating how many people don't have their basic needs met, and hopefully we're moving in the right direction.
I hope so. I have a lot of faith in our younger generation. I really do.
Yeah,
And I'm fortunate to work with a lot of people who are younger and have been interns in and around the organizations I'm a part of, that they are asking much harder questions,
yeah,
and holding a lot of, whether it's products or companies or even our organization, like more accountable than I think has happened in the past. So despite all the troubles in the world, I have a lot of hope and faith in sort of the next generation and their
yeah.
accountability.
Yeah, I think it's important to be optimistic in general, in that, in our world, the media may focus on a lot of negativity, but there certainly are a lot of good things happening, things moving in the right direction. And I agree with you. The next generation is on a better start than ours in
Yeah,
that regard.
yeah, I think that's true.
Of course, yeah. And I know that people listening are inspired by what you're doing and all the cool organizations you're involved with. What is the best way for listeners to support you and your impact?
Well, I mean, there's a couple different ways. The selfish plug is go listen to our podcast as well. the the Global Good Podcast, the globalgoodpodcast.com. Super easy to find.
I will be sure to link
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Feed a Billion could always use your support. And I can tell you, $1 equals one meal. We've gotten our costs so low. So $1 is a meal. So I don't think of it as people even donating money. It's like, how many meals? How many meals can you provide to a girl? Something as simple as $5. You just fed a girl all 5 days of school. It's really that easy.
I really appreciate organizations that have that kind of transparency where you really get an understanding of what each dollar
Yeah,
does.
and we can show a lot of it goes to almond farmers and whatnot. We really do break down like the products that go in every single thing, like where it goes, and the farmers, all local. So even like in India, our products are made by local farmers. Here in the U.S., our almond farmers are in California. Mexico, we have a Mexico City plant. Or we don't. Blend Hub, our partner, does. Right. There's complete transparency working with Blend Hub. I love it. And so yes, $1 equals a meal. Also volunteer, feedabillion.org. We're easy to find on social media. And last, I'm pretty easy to find. Myself, I did get married a year and a half ago. So my previous last name was Fisher, Nicole Fisher. So a lot of my Forbes work is under that, but now it's Nicole Roberts. So it's sort of a still transition period for me. So some of my social media is Nicole F. Roberts, like Instagram. I think Twitter is still under Nick Fisher, though. I just haven't gotten around to changing it.
It's a lot.
But yeah, I'm easy to find if you Google me, particularly I know if you put like Forbes or Feed a Billion or something at the end. I'm super easy to find, even with a basic name.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank
I know we
you.
went a little longer than
Yeah,
anticipated.
but that's
Um,
okay.
I, I really appreciate it. Excited to get these messages out there and to personally continue our conversation.
Yeah, I'm here. If you ever need me for anything, just let me know.
Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. To find out more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.